Hi everyone, this is lecture 8 on brain functions and the cranial nerves. This is the second part on the function of the brain. Originally it was all one lecture, but I found that it was too large of a lecture to cover in 1 hour, so I divided it up into 2 parts. The major objectives for lecture 8 is to continue to describe the structure and function of the diencephalon. You remember, it's like the peach pit in the very center of the brain. We'll discuss a little bit more about the cerebellum, probably the second largest structure of the brain. And then we'll continue with the brain stem. That includes the pons and midbrain and medulla. We'll mention briefly the reticular activating system and the basal nuclei. And then, in order to get kind of an idea of the complexity of the brain, we'll talk about the connections between the commissures, associations, and projection fibers. Finally, we'll end the lecture with how to go about studying for the cranial nerves. Remember, you often learn them by name, number, function, as well as their site of origin and effector. So let's begin. Let's start with the basal nuclei. Now, if you remember the definition of the nuclei, these are cell bodies within the central nervous system. And the basal nuclei are on each side of the diencephalon. Okay, so here is showing the basal nuclei. And there are many different structures within the basal nuclei, but we're just going to name 2 of them. One is called the striatum, which is right here, and the globus pallidus, which is right here. Now, together, they're both involved in movement. So obviously, damage to the basal nuclei will have some negative impact on being able to move, on the control of movement. But individuals with damage to the basal nuclei have other ailments as well, such as behavioral, cognitive, and perception problems. So it's much more complicated than just plain movement. Let's talk a little bit about the cerebral white matter. Remember, the white matter refers to the myelinated axons. And there are different types of fibers that we find in the cerebral white matter. And these are the commissure, projection, and association fibers. And this should give you just a kind of a little glimpse of the complexity of the connections within the cerebrum. Okay, let's start with the commissural fibers. So here we have a frontal section of the brain. And you can see how in this figure right here, it's sliced, the brain is sliced into anterior and posterior halves. Commissural fibers connects the right and left cerebral hemispheres together. Now, if you remember that the cerebrum is divided into cerebral hemispheres. So here's the right side right here, and here's the left side here. And the commissural fibers connects the 2 cerebral hemispheres together. Now, in the lab, you'll learn a structure called the corpus callosum, which connects the 2 brain halves together. And so these are dominantly found in the corpus callosum. Another type of fiber are the projection fibers, which I have indicated right here. These connect the cerebral cortex of one hemisphere with other areas of the same hemisphere. So if we look at the projection fibers, we can see that these are these reddish ones that extend here from the white matter uh, to other areas of the brain. So it connects the cerebral cortex in one hemisphere, but the other areas of the same hemisphere. Also with other areas of the brain and spinal cord. Okay, so they're going from one cortex to other parts of the cortex and also to the spinal cord. The third type of fiber are the association fibers. And these are restricted to a single hemisphere. So you see the association fibers are in green here. For example, here's some right here. And these connect the gray matter of cortical gyri with one another. So you can see within each cerebral hemisphere, we have the association fibers. So we can see how different ways the cerebrum are interconnected by these fibers. Okay, so for example, this is just a possible scenario of a conduction pathway that might occur within the brain. So if we look at number 1 here, we see an action potential originates in one of the gray matter regions of the brain, right here. The action potential travels to another area of gray matter by the projection fibers, so along this route here. A new action potential is generated and sent to the neighboring gray matter by association fibers. So it goes here. Then finally, another action potential is generated and sent to the other cerebral hemispheres by the Commissural Fibers. That crosses over. So in this brief example, we've demonstrated how the 3 different fibers can work together to allow the brain to communicate with other parts of the brain. Okay, so of course this is a very simplistic view, but that kind of gives you an idea of what is occurring during communication within the brain. Okay, now let's move on to the diencephalon again. The diencephalon includes the thalamus, the epithalamus, and the hypothalamus. Okay, so in this picture of the brain, we see the diencephalon, and remember we said it's sort of like this little peach pit in the center of the brain of everything. And so this is what we're going to be discussing right now. Okay, one part of the diencephalon is the thalamus. Okay, and gray matter receives input of the thalamus receives input from all other parts of the brain, well, nearly all parts of the brain, such as the cerebral cortex, the cerebellum, the basal nuclei, and the limbic system. You might think of the thalamus sort of like the grand central station of the brain, because almost all information goes to the thalamus and then gets rerouted to other parts of the brain. So in this picture, we see the diencephalon here, and here we can see the thalamus right here. And as I just mentioned, that most information passes through the thalamus to reach the cerebral cortex. So information will go to the thalamus, go to other parts of the brain. It might come back to the thalamus to go other parts of the brain. So the thalamus is very important. Now, the hypothalamus, as you might expect, with the prefix hypo, is going to be right beneath the thalamus. And this nuclei regulates many functions for survival. It is so important that we'll have a separate lecture in the endocrine system because it communicates through the release of factors in the bloodstream. Okay, so here's the thalamus. Okay, and beneath the thalamus is the hypothalamus right here. Okay. two hormones that it produces are oxytocin, which you might have learned in 203 for the stimulation of labor. And another hormone, which we'll talk a lot about later, is called the anti-diuretic hormone. So if you know what diuresis means, diuresis is the process of urination, removal of fluids. An anti-diuretic allows you to retain fluids. In addition, later in the semester, we'll talk about other hormones it secretes that controls the pituitary gland. And you can see the pituitary gland is connected by the hypothalamus by a little structure called the infundibulum. And here's the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus actually is controlling the pituitary gland. And so, as I mentioned, the pituitary gland is connected by the infundibulum here. And the pituitary gland is also an endocrine organ that secretes hormones that affects the rest of the other glands of the body to secrete their hormones. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus in the lecture on the endocrine system. So for right now, we're just trying to show its relationship with the thalamus and it's part of the diencephalon. Other structures that is part of the diencephalon are the mammillary bodies. Okay, so here it's a really tiny area right here. Okay, and this connects the hypothalamus to the limbic system. Okay, so we mentioned the thalamus is like the grand central station, and so it's no different with the hypothalamus, and it connects to the thalamus through the mammillary bodies. And it also receives input from the hippocampus to regulate memory and behavior. So if you remember from the previous lecture, we mentioned about the hippocampus and its role in memory. Another region is called the epithalamus. And I call it a region because it's really hard to really specifically identify, but especially on the brain models, you just kind of get an idea of where it is. But one structure of significance is the pineal gland. And pineal gland is also an endocrine gland, and it secretes a hormone called melatonin. And so here, you can see right here is the pineal gland right here. Okay. Now, melatonin is a hormone that regulates the sleep-wake cycle. Okay, so you might see commercials where stores are selling melatonin to help you sleep. Okay, finally, the cerebellum. And this forms the posterior and inferior part of the brain, which we showed in a previous lecture. And so you really can't miss it because the cerebellum is a fairly large structure here. And if you remember, it has cerebellar hemispheres, okay, much like the cerebrum. And remember, we said that the white matter forms tree-like structures called the arbor vitae. And the cerebellum functions in the coordination of movement. Okay, and so the cerebellum, like the cerebrum, as we just mentioned, is composed of two cerebellar hemispheres. So this picture is showing the left cerebellar hemisphere right here. The right one has been removed to show other structures. Now, much like the cerebrum, the cerebellum has an outer gray cerebellar cortex, and the inner white matter is internal to the gray matter. Okay, but it does have clusters of gray matter within it, and it forms the white matter forms a tree-like structure, and it's given the name the arbor vitae. Okay, so this figure shows the cerebral cortex, the gray matter on the outside. Okay, and then in this figure is showing the arbor vitae that has its branch-like structures here. So in many of these figures I've been showing you, if you realize that the first figure on the left is an illustration, and the figure on the right is actually a dissection of the actual structure of the human brain. Okay. Just like other structures of the brain, it's connected. The cerebellum is connected to the brainstem by tracts of white matter, and these tracts of white matter are called as cerebellar peduncles. Okay, and so here, for example, is the middle cerebellar peduncle. Okay. One of the oldest parts of the brain, as you previously mentioned, is the brainstem. And as you might expect, as being the oldest part of the brain, it controls some of the basic vital structures for survival. And so here we can see the picture of the brain. Remember, the diencephalon is that peach pit in the middle, and then like a little handle is the brainstem. Okay. So in this figure, it looks kind of like alien right here, but here's the diencephalon, and then the brainstem is going inferior to it. So the brainstem is anterior to the cerebellum, which is down here, and superior to the spinal cord, because the spinal cord is continuing down here. And as we just mentioned, the brainstem controls the basic homeostatic functions. And you might have learned in 203 that certain parts of the brainstem have functions for heart rate and also breathing. Okay, and there's many other functions such as reflexes, movements, sensations, and maintaining alertness. So these are all kind of ingrained functions that many organisms, which functions in many organisms, not just in humans. There are three parts of the brainstem. Okay, the first part is the midbrain, so it's right here. Okay. Another region is the pons, which you might have learned in 203. So this is right here. And the medulla oblongata, which is right here. So the big bump from a side view is the pons, and the smaller bump is the medulla oblongata. Let's start with the midbrain. Okay, it's divided into two regions. The upper region is the superior colliculus, and the lower part is the inferior colliculus. The superior colliculus has functions in visual coordination, and inferior colliculi has functions in auditory coordination. Okay, I won't show this to you, but you can look at this YouTube video. It's from The Big Bang Theory, and where Sheldon demonstrates his functioning of the superior colliculus. The second region of the brainstem is the pons, and these contain descending tracts. Okay, so if you remember, I mentioned the brainstem has two bumps. The big one is the pons, and the smaller bump is the medulla oblongata. So we're interested in the pons right here, the bigger bump. Okay, going back to our figure of the pons right here, one structure of the pons is the reticular formation. Okay, and so you can see the reticular formation in the pons, but you can see that it extends upward and it also extends downward into medulla oblongata. So it's not exclusively in the pons. So these nuclei regulates various movements in the pons for breathing, reflexes, sleep, and arousal. Okay, so these are showing the descending motor tracts. And here it's showing the reticular formation in yellow, right here. The third region of the brainstem is the medulla oblongata. And this is the inferior most of the brainstem and just superior to the spinal cord. Okay, so the smaller of the two bumps is the medulla oblongata, and down here is the spinal cord. Okay, back to this picture again. Here's the medulla oblongata. Okay, and it also contains the reticular formation as it extends all the way down here in yellow. Now, a structure of the medulla oblongata are called the pyramids, and these pyramids are shown right here. Okay, and these are ridges that contain upper motor neurons. Okay, later in the later lecture, we'll talk about upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons, and the more superior motor neurons are found here in the medulla oblongata. We've been mentioning about the reticular formation and its functions, and it's a very complicated structure. More than 100 motor nuclei are located in reticular formation, so it's a very complicated area of the brain, and it receives input from different parts of the brain, from the cerebral cortex, the limbic system, and sensory stimuli. Okay, so it feeds information from all different parts of the brain. It functions in sleep, pain transmission, of course, motor functions, mood, breathing, and blood pressure. So it has a wide variety of functions in controlling the body. Finally, a major means of communication from the brain are the cranial nerves. And you're going to have to know each one by name, number, function, origin, and destination. Okay. Now, there are different ways. There's some easy ways of remembering the cranial nerves as you learn them. Okay. And you got to know them by name and number. Okay. So remember, there are 12 cranial nerves, and they're named by they're numbered by Roman numerals. So if you don't know your Roman numerals, here's your chance to learn them. Okay. So we have O, once one takes the anatomy. Final, very good, vacations are happening. And these are named, the first letter is named by each of the cranial nerves. Unfortunately, I went forward, now I can't go backwards. Sorry about that. And so we have 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 for the 12 cranial nerves. Now, the cranial nerves can also be divided by their function. Okay, so this time I won't advance so quickly. So here are the Roman numerals for each cranial nerve. Here are the names of the cranial nerves. And here's a little mnemonic to remember them by. And cranial nerves are either sensory, motor, or mixed. So they can be both. So for example, the trigeminal is a mixed one with both sensory and motor functions. Okay. Ocular motor is only motor, and olfactory is only sensory. And this is, you have to know this too for the course. So we have some say money matters, but my, and these refer to the olfactory, optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal abducens nerve, and these first letters refer to their functions: sensory, motor, motor. B is for both, and M is motor. Now, if you go to the rest of them, my brother says big brains matters more, and these are the second set of cranial nerves: 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. And again, the first letter of the mnemonic refers to the functions. So we have both, sensory, both, motor, and motor. Now, one way to remember these is know the sensory motor ones, and the other ones has to be both. There's different ways of learning them. Okay. Now, if you're a visual person, this figure might help you as well, because here is showing the location, the origins and the destinations of the cranial nerves. Of course, in the lab, you're going to have to identify these, but I'm more interested in knowing, rather than identifying them, knowing where they innervate and feed back to. Okay, so for example, the oculomotor, trochlear, and abducens innervate the muscles of the eye, and so these are all motor. And the vagus nerve is very complicated. We only show two regions here, but it has many innervations and feedback from many different organs of the thoracic and abdominal cavity. Okay, so you're going to have to know these for the test as well. Now, in your lecture text, there's major tables covering each of the cranial nerves, which is kind of intimidating, but this is a good reference. Now, on Blackboard, I summarized this kind of intimidating figure in a little more easier to use matter. And when I write the test, I use my table that I rewrote for the cranial nerves. So you might use that for studying. Okay, but this is just as a reference if you don't have access to the textbook. Okay, and so you're going to have to learn the name, number, function. It's each cranial nerve's destination and origin for each of the cranial nerves.